Welcome to Dev Bootcamp Life, the podcast where we help you level up so you become the best software engineer on your team, or we help you level up to land your first engineering job. This is Juan Lizarazo.
And this is Jared Potter.
And today we're going to discuss something very powerful and something that is going to help you truly level up, especially if you're new to the industry. So, Jared, what are we going to discuss today?
Yeah, so the topic today is titled JavaScript Best Practices for the Modern Engineer. So through teaching, I've noticed this with a lot of my students, there's a lot of foundational aspects of how do you build great JavaScript? How do you go about that? And we go about that through these best practices. Now, a lot of these best practices that you're going to hear today might seem kind of simple at times, but these are the foundation for the pieces to build great applications, right? So we're going to be focusing on JavaScript today. We're not going to be talking about TypeScript. TypeScript, at some point in time, if you're building a large enough application in a business environment, does make sense to use. But today we're going to be just focusing on JavaScript.
Yeah, let's keep it simple. Sounds good. So Jared, let's start. What will be the first practice we're going to discuss today?
Yeah, totally. So the first topic I think that a lot of my students have struggled with is creating descriptive variable and function names. A lot of the times I see students creating really short variables, names like just A, B, C, D, or something like that, or they'll try to create like abbreviated versions of names. But I'm not really into that. I prefer to have descriptive variable names. And honestly, even if it's a little bit longer, that's okay. At the end of the day, the whole point of building these best practices is that we're in the future when someone else is maintaining this code, that they're going to be able to come in and understand it. So Juan, what are some of your tips for how to name variables or functions better?
Yeah. So that one is like it's so fundamental, especially new software engineers like they start writing and even myself, like when I started like writing, you try to write like minified for the machine, right? So I always tell my students, don't write code for the machine, let the machine do its work, write code for humans. Even if it means that you have a variable with 20 characters, that's fine, because at some point, right, this is going to be optimized for the machine, right? Code for humans. So for variable naming, answering your question, Jared, it's very simple. So one of the things is like use consistent naming, right? That's fundamental. But traditionally for JavaScript, you want to use camel case for variables, for objects, right? For function names. And you want to use Pascal case for class names. And that makes it easy because if you're building APIs, when it serializes the response, then it's easy to consume it in JavaScript if you don't use underscores, right? Another one, let's see, for naming, don't use short names, right? Be descriptive. Write self-documenting code, and we'll talk more about that later. But yeah, like when you use a function name, instead of saying function A and it does something and then the engineer has to figure it out, if you write function say hello, you immediately know this function says hello, right? Somehow, maybe a log, maybe an alert. We don't care. We look at it, right? But definitely that's the good naming. Naming things is hard. Another one I like to tell my students is, for example, have the not the type, but sort of the type. It can be part of the name, but not describing the type. So what I'm saying is not saying like cars array, for example. No, not really. But like what the implicit naming, it just means that, for example, if I say car, it could be a string or just one object. But if I do cars, it implies it is a collection. So good use of plurals and singulars will help you write cleaner code and picking better names. One of the hardest things in software engineering is naming things, and that's a fact. We have such a hard time naming things. So if you don't get it right the first time, when you find a better name, just refactor through your IDE and get a better name.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Now, just a couple bits to add to that as well. When you're dealing with a Boolean, so a true or false value for either a variable or for a function that returns a Boolean, oftentimes you could use the prefix is. So you could say like is valid, or is loading, or there's lots of, you basically could give it a name that will describe whether or not it's going to be true or false is one way. And another quick tip is that if you do have the opportunity to have someone else review your code, that's a great opportunity to, gauge its readability. Hopefully it's going to be someone who actually reads your code and not just says, oh yeah, it looks great, hits merge, right? But getting that feedback really can help from a readability standpoint.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, that's really good. And that takes me to like the next tip, right? For the modern JavaScript engineer, modern best practices. Um, because when we talk about naming, consistent naming, but like when do we do like one name or one other name, right? So there's like there is style guides. So what my next tip would be like early in the project or when you start a project on day one, pick a style guide if you don't have one or your team doesn't have one or the company doesn't have one. And that also defines usually a lot of things like if you use underscore, snake case, or if you use Pascal case, or how do you name things, where do you put things, like different naming declaration, if you use var or let or cons, like all those different things are defined. So there's different style guides out there for JavaScript. So one that I really like is called idiomatic.js. That one, I really like it. Airbnb also has one. You can search for Airbnb style guide and JavaScript, and I think they have a very good one. And there's the Google one, which is like the very classical one that I recommend that you read at least once. They have a very specific, super large one. It's like a lot of pages if you read it, like if you were to print it. But those will describe a lot of things. And the nice thing about a style guide is like, it not only says like, oh, just do this just because. It usually tells you the why, so you can level up and learn more good practices when it comes to consistent styling and naming conventions.
Yeah, no,
So
that's a really good idea. And how does that interact with things like ESLint or Prettier?
So usually the style guides, they can be, for example, it depends on the style guide, right? Some style guides are not compatible with tooling, but then that would mean we need to talk about now ESLint and Prayer. That could be our next topic, but I mean our next item. But yeah, some style guides are not compatible with all the plugins, but sometimes there's plugins for example, you pick ESLint and you can get the ESLint Airbnb plugin and stuff like that, and then you can extend it or you can customize it to match your style guide. But it's just easy that because this has been already done, right? You don't have to reinvent the wheel, so you can just find out one you like and then see that is if it is consistent. The nice thing is, like for example, Prated and ESLint, like sometimes the style guides cover usually the gaps that these automated tools don't. So the idea is like the style guide is more like filling in the gaps. So the idea is like the engineer, you don't have to remember everything. Like, hey, remember these 2000 rules. No, it's more like, hey, look, do what the tool says, right? Do what ESLint says, do what Prayer says. And then when it doesn't apply, look at the style guide. We have these 20 items, right? For example, the names. The names Prayer ESLint is not going to really help you. Maybe ESLint can flag it, but good names, that's a human thing, right? So that's so really like a combination of style guide and those automated tools, which we can talk about in a little
Yeah.
bit or next if you want to bring it up now.
Yeah, we'll see if we get to it. There's, I think, a couple of other like really foundational things I'd like to go over as well. So I think the next topic for best practices in JavaScript would be functions. So there's lots to talk about in regards to functions, but a couple of the aspects are, making sure that your function is doing a reasonable amount of work. Okay. I think many of us have seen functions that are hundreds of lines long. If your function is hundreds of lines long, it's probably a lot harder to read and understand. It's probably near impossible to effectively unit test if you need to do that. So being able to be aware of, maybe the first time through, yeah, you're writing a solution, you write a giant function, but then going back, being able to refactor, like, okay, I can move this section into its own function. I can move this section into its own function. And it's really going to help with readability when your brain is looking at a function. It doesn't have to keep track of all this context as you're scrolling through. Instead, you can look at it, what parameters are coming in, you're seeing what work is being done, and then what outputs are coming out. So just trying to be aware of not having your functions be too long. There's rules of thumb out there of like if your function's longer than like 10 lines or 15 lines or 20 lines, I'm not going to recommend a hard and fast rule. but just be aware of that, because when someone comes back to read and maintain your code, that's going to be really helpful. Anything to add to that one?
Yeah, for me, it's like, yeah, between 25 and 30 lines is like the sweet spot. I mean, if it is less, that's fine. But also, like, if you have a function that does too little, let's say you have a function that is just one line, the function is doing too little, maybe you don't really need that function. So keep a balance. I mean, your function should be doing, usually how I like to tell my students, like, your function should do one thing and do it well. And that one thing could be maybe 15, 20 steps, that's fine, right? But make sure that if your function has more than 30 lines, maybe you want to consider splitting it up, because it will have all the benefits that you just mentioned. Unit testing, readability, maintainability, can be used in isolation most of the times, right? But yeah, no, that's a very good one, because
Yeah.
that will help you build better software.
Yeah, to continue going on with some tips for working with functions as well is, and one thing to avoid is getting overly nested within a function. So when we have things like for loops and if statements, and also when we're using a lot of the array functions like map or reduce or filter, we can begin getting like deeper and deeper into this nested realm in our functions. And the deeper and deeper you go, the harder and harder it is to read that function and to be able to maintain that function. So I strive to have my functions be as linear as possible, taking discrete individual steps. And some people might think that this is overly verbose, but I honestly find it incredibly useful for when I do have bugs in my software. I do have bugs in my software. We're not perfect here. That it's going to be a lot easier to see. So when I call a function, I make sure that I usually assign that to a distinct variable before I then use that variable. And that's another thing too, is if you're trying to pack like a function call within a function call within a function call on one line, it's going to be a lot harder again to debug and maintain that code.
Yeah, that's pretty much, yeah, that's the depth of the function, right? Of the function calls that you have. Like if you go to a function and then opens another one and another one, right? And you have 20 levels deep, that's not really good code or maintainable code. So yeah, usually I try to keep it maybe up to 2 levels. Like more than 2 levels, like I rethink my solution, because that's gonna be too hard to trace. I mean, maybe your function is spread out, and maybe the boundaries of the function, or the purpose of the function is not established correctly, and maybe you need to rethink the way you're trying to solve the problem, because it can become very complicated. Yeah, no, that's a good one. And regarding functions, Jared, like one of the things that has to come, if we talk about functions, we got to talk about this, and it's purity. So pure functions. That one of the things that really changed, like really helped me level up. Like I went up so much with like in my level when I write JavaScript, was when I learned about functional programming. So I recommend that you go read, everybody listening out there, go and read about functional programming, often referred as FP. And that one talks, one of the fundamentals is purity. So in a nutshell, pure functions is just functions that don't have shared state. They don't work with mutable references, right? They don't mutate references. They avoid side effects, and just means that if you receive the same input 100 times, it's always going to return the same output 100 times. It doesn't have external dependencies. So if you write functions as pure functions, you're going to write, your code is going to be just so great. So that's one of the things that when we talk about functions in JavaScript, talk about purity. Not all the functions can be pure, but if you are aimed to have most of the functions pure, you're going to have an easier time. It's okay to combine with object-oriented programming, since usually we program in an object-oriented world, right? But keep that in mind. What do you think of that, Jared?
Yeah, absolutely. Pure functions, as much as you can, try to leverage them, and yeah, go read as much as you can about them. Just to add perhaps a simplified example is like in JavaScript, when you have an object, objects are by reference. So when you pass an object to a function, inside that function, if you modify that object inside the function, you are also modifying it outside of the function. And this is what we generally call a side effect, because we're modifying the external state of the function, and it just kind of makes things a little bit more murky, a little bit more complex. It's not necessarily always a bad thing. There's times where it's necessary to do this, but we try to avoid it as much as we can. We want our functions to be clean and linear in what they're trying to perform, so that they're easier to read and maintain. If you do need to like modify an object that's coming in, you'll want to clone it in some way, ensuring that depending on its depth that you're using an appropriate clone function to do
Yeah.
that. But
Yeah, you
yeah,
never
definitely
modify
strive for that.
the argument you are receiving directly, but you can always modify. You want to modify something external. What Jared was saying is critical, which is if sometimes it's necessary, right? You can modify something external, but you can do it using, like, for example, this dot something, like an attribute inside the same class if you're working with classes. So then it makes sense that it's not modifying the argument, but it's modifying something external, but it's still a safer approach. You never modify it directly, because a side effect always leads to bugs and defects as bad software, right? Um,
Yeah,
so
and I think like we said in last week's episode, when we're building on top of errors or on top of bugs, it's
of a
harder
lie.
and harder and harder to open that up and to actually
Mm-hmm.
find the root issue.
Yeah, you build on top of a lie, and the moment you fix it, you expose a lot of bugs and issues. So you want to avoid that early on. So Jared, I'm gonna take a break here, and I'm gonna share with our listeners and our audience. I'm gonna share our Twitter accounts. So if you want to reach out, we're available on Twitter. So I'm on twitter.com Juan Lizarazo G. So that's spelled out JuanLizarAzog. Tweet at me, get in touch, and we can discuss anything JavaScript.
Yep. And everybody can find me at twitter.com/Jared Potter. That's JaredPotter. And yeah, please feel free to reach out to me, send me a direct message. I'd love to perhaps look at some of your code that you would like to have a little bit reviewed and how it might be improved. Feel free to reach out.
Yeah, and this week we'll tweet a little bit about we'll tweet a little bit about like this topic about good JavaScript practices, and I have some links I want to share with you. So check out Twitter if you want to get access to them. Cool. So Jared, what's the next tip? The next item?
Definitely. So the next tip is going to be to make sure that you fully understand and leverage the truthy falsy nature of JavaScript. I think that there's a lot of students that initially gain a grasp of it, but they may not understand all of the different circumstances that you can use it. So I guess what I mean by this is if in JavaScript we have this convenience where in a Boolean environment, a conditional environment, if we say if and then we pass something into the parentheses there, one of the nice things about JavaScript is we can just pass in a variable, and depending on the type of that variable and the value of that variable, it will evaluate to either true or false. And this is a really nice shortcut in JavaScript that makes it a little bit easier and faster to code. But making sure that you really understand all the different types and how they work is going to be crucial to writing great JavaScript. I think one that mixes people up at times is when they try to do it on a number, and the number then happens to be 0, which then causes it to be false. So it's really important to be aware of what type is going in there and how it's being evaluated. But knowing how to do that well is going to reflect well in your coding interviews, because the interviewer will understand that you do know how to use truthy falsy and how to leverage it correctly. And perhaps there might be a situation where you need to, instead of just getting away with the abbreviated implicit condition, you might need to actually code the explicit version, right? With the triple equals or the exclamation mark equals for the not case. But yeah, just making sure that you understand that. And we've mentioned this before in, I believe it was our JavaScript technical interview questions. But yeah, just go and play with it. Go and open up yourself either Stack Blitz or just VS Code or whatever, and just kind of play around with different variables, different values, and how they get executed in an if statement.
Yeah, one common case where like this always gets people is one common bug for not understanding truthy or falsy properly is that they have, for example, a number and they check if the number, right? For example, my variable is total, and then they check, oh, if total, right? And then they execute something, and there's like they expect to have a total, but sometimes that code never executes because the total happens to be 0, and then they don't know why it's not running, and because I have a number, and it's because they don't understand that 0 evaluates to false in a Boolean context. One easy way to know when something is truthy or falsy is that you can wrap it into the Boolean native function. So you just, is capital B, Boolean, open parentheses, type whatever value you want, close it, and that's going to cast into truth or false. So you'll know if it is truthy or false. Or another way, use the double not operator, the negate operator. So you use like the exclamation mark, and the value, and that will show true or false. So those are the easy ways that like myself, I use that when I am not sure if something evaluates to true or false, when, especially when I have a lot of conditions and things. So that's one quick check I do.
Yeah, no, that's a really great tip to know how to interact with the truthy falsiness there.
Yeah.
For the next topic, this one's kind of small here, but the variable prefixes that we look at. So const, let, and var, right? Again, we talked about this in our former episode as well. But generally speaking, most of the time, most of your variables are going to be const. And only in a few specific situations where you need it to be let, will you then use let, right? So the idea is if you're using const, that variable is not intended to be reassigned. And in fact, you can't. You'll get a JavaScript error if you attempt to reassign it. If you do need something that needs to have the ability to change, we use let. And as we mentioned before, we discourage the use of var due to its hoisting nature in JavaScript. It's important to understand hoisting. You might get asked that question in an interview of like, why not use var? And that is something to understand. So definitely go read more about these prefixes if you haven't already. But yeah, generally speaking, use const, use let. You know, I have a few, friends out there who I've seen, they'll use vars or they'll use lets for everything and they defend it. And I have to politely disagree with them in that, if you're in a coding interview and you're using var, that's going to reflect bad on you. Most engineers are going to
Look it down,
not
especially in
look down on it.
2020. In 2020, it's like you shouldn't be using var anymore, because we have tools to, so you don't have to do it. One of the things, like for me to remember, like if I have to use var or const, right? I don't really think about it. I was like use const, and then if I need to reassign, usually the IDE is gonna yell at me, right? It's gonna say like, hey, you cannot reassign this. This is a const, right? Or it's not gonna compile. But one easy way is like if we talk about a static analysis, I would say like always have a static analysis tool. So your IDE usually is gonna have that built in. It's gonna tell you like, hey, this is not reassigned. Change to const, right? Or use what we talked about, ESLint. So go to Google, type ESLint, LINT, learn how to set that up, configure it with your style guide, right? With the plugins. And that usually is going to yell at you and tell you like when something should be var or when something should be let or const. And if you write var, it will tell you, hey, you cannot use var, use let instead or use const instead. So a static analysis, definitely something you got to use in 2020.
Yeah, absolutely. Completely agree. One more tip I have here. I have a couple more tips, but I also want to hear perhaps some of your top tips. One is, and this is kind of a general programming thing, is when you have string literals in your code. And so a string literal is where, you have double quotes or single quotes, and then you have some value inside. Let's say you have it in an if statement. You're trying to check if this variable equals this string literal. When you have situations like that, a really good practice to do is to take those string literals and define them as constants at the top of your file. This way, you know that they'll never be reassigned, they'll never be changed, and it's also good organization to keep them all up there. There are so many bugs out there from what are called, magic strings, essentially is the term that you might hear out there of, again, it's just someone who's defined a literal string in code in the middle of it. And you don't know where that's at or where it might sneak up. So to help organize this, we can put them at the top of the file. If you need a more advanced implementation of this, you can eventually put these in enumerables to represent them that way. But just even in the short term, putting them at the top of the file, defining them as constant. And you'll also usually, there's a couple different stylings on how you'll name the variables. Some people will use capital letters and underscores for these variable names to make it really clear that they're a specific type of variable, a string
Yeah.
constant.
So constants, yeah, constants help you with normalization. So you abstract those and you avoid typos. Like if you're typing a string everywhere, right? Like you type like something everywhere, like type is car, right? Then that means like it's a good sign that like, hey, this should be in a constant, and because it's gonna be normalized, it's gonna be self-documenting. So your code is self-documenting and it's gonna be centralized. And then if you want it on top of the file, right? It depends like is anybody else cares about this. If any other file, any other class, any other component cares about it, then you put it in a shared constants file. And one thing I want to share is that you would use enumerations, because enumerables is a different thing. So enumerations is what you would use for normalizing these variables. So and this is like something for you to Google, right? For you listening out there, but like there's enumerables, enumerations, and enumerators. So don't get confused with that. So we're talking about enumerations, okay? And that will really help you abstract those constant values too. But no, yeah, that's a good one. One thing that reminds me is that when you are using like your code, you should never, when you, not that you talk about magic strings, your code should be declarative. Like for example, if you have dynamic variable attributes, for example, you have some object, a square bracket, some variable, right, that changes the attribute and then closing a square bracket, and you have that like a lot in a lot of places. Like pretty much the rule of thumb for me and for many engineers is that if I cannot perform a string search, like, and if I cannot open my IDE, search for that string usage or that variable, right, and find it everywhere where it's used, and I can delete it or change it. If you like think about this, can I search these in through my ID? Like can so and find all the instances for the same, all the results. And if you cannot find it, right, that's a good way to think that like that code is not good. You gotta change it. You gotta normalize it, or you gotta like no, don't use this magic there, because sometimes we try to get magical and over abstract, but then that's so unmaintainable. And it's okay to repeat a little bit more, right? To be more declarative. It's better declarative than imperative. So declarative code is always better.
Yeah, absolutely. Uh, Juan, are there other specific tips that we haven't mentioned yet that you'd like to add?
Yeah. So common ones, for example, when it comes to tooling, right? Tooling always like makes your life easier because you don't have to think. Like it's like do what the tool says and then that's it. We call it a day. And if the tool doesn't say it, the style guide, right? So tools, Prettier, like search for Prettier, learn how to use Prettier, configure it to meet your style guide stuff, right? The Prettier is gonna automate the code formatting, so you don't have to think like, do I put this space, open square bracket, or do I leave spaces between my curly braces when I do imports, or do I like? You don't have to think that Prettier does it for you, and it takes just a second to do it or milliseconds, or you can automatically just run it as you say file. So Prettier normalizes how the teams write code. Very powerful and popular tool in 2020. Another thing like that relates to spaces. There's always the discussion between teams, like, do I use spaces or tabs? And then there's the fight. No, spaces or tabs, spaces or tabs. The answer to this, I'm going to give you the answer. This is going to be amazing. Just pick one and be consistent. If you do spaces, 2 spaces or 4 spaces, that's fine. Stick with it. Do all your code consistently, including your HTML, your CSS, everything uses the same. And that's going to help with Prettier, for example, with automation to auto format that. But if you do spaces and tabs and start combining, that is not good. So either go with tabs, either go with spaces, go with whatever the team has already established. For example, the TypeScript source code uses tabs, right? But Angular uses spaces, 2 spaces, right? So it depends. It's okay. Just don't combine them because that makes the code consistent. And that has to be with tooling. And the big one I would share, the big tip in 2020, write unit test. Pick a testing framework, testing library. There's so many out there. Jasmine, Jest, testing dome library. There's like Mocha and Sinon and all these other tools. Pick one, learn it, use it. Okay, always write code And usually because the best code you write is code that you can unit test. If you cannot unit test a unit of code or a function, let's say what Jared said, a function with 4,000 lines that you cannot unit test, that code is not good. It's bad code. So that will force you to be a good engineer and write very good, clean, self-documenting, right, unit testable code. So those would be like the three I can add right now. What do you think of that, Jared?
Yeah, no, that's spot on there. One thing I would add is that, I mean, a lot of times, you know, the way that we learn these best practices, or at least the best practices of your team, is by interacting with them. And also just being, well, you know, two sides to it. One side is, you know, helping to establish best practices and consistent practices on your team, if you happen to be on a team. But if you're, I mean, and then if you're in the opposite case where you're coming into a team that already has established practices, you know, be receptive and open to feedback from your team on helping get your code more in line. You know, as much as possible, you know, I mean, this is a whole podcast topic on its own, essentially like empathetic code reviews, but being able to, you know, both deliver feedback to somebody, but also being able to receive it and realize that it's not, you know, they're not putting some sort of value on your worth, right? They're literally helping, generally speaking, to improve your coding, your ability to create great code.
Yeah.
So just being receptive to that, I think, is being important.
Yeah, I think that's good. So one last practice I want to share. We're almost out of time. So the last practice I want to share, and if you have one last one, we can share it, Jared. But one last one I want to share is, and it has to do with tooling, because tooling helps you write better code. It has to do with use module bundlers, use module loaders. Usually, the reason for this is because many of the module bundlers out there, like Webpack or Parcel, they have, or even Rollup, I think using Babel, right? Babel. They have built-in transpilation. So that means that you can use 2020 features, right? Like private attributes, and it's going to transpile into ES5 for you, which is usually like more verbose, long, harder to understand using bars instead of let, all that, right? But using module bundlers helps you with tree shaking. Read about that. I'm not going to explain it right now, but that's like a topic on its own for another podcast episode. Or it includes the transpilation, where you can use modern features, better code, cleaner, and then it transpiles for you. And that's other things for you. So in 2020, you should be using, even for smaller projects, like if you have 3 JavaScript files, it still is a good idea to use module bundlers, or like Parcel or Webpack, because they will help you write cleaner code, because then the target, the deployable, is going to be targeted to all their browsers, but you don't have to think about those things. So that's my last one for today, Jared. Do you have any other you want to add?
No, I don't. So I think we'll just jump into the recap here.
Yeah.
So again, all these different topics that we mentioned here, you can go and pick a few of them or all of them and go read a little bit about them. So we talked about how to create descriptive variable and function names. We talked about when you're creating functions, making sure that they're a good size, you know. I think Juan mentioned like 25, 30 lines max, being able to break them up, making sure you're controlling the depth or the nestedness of the functions, making sure it's not getting too deep. We talked about pure functions, you know, and how you can make your functions more unit testable, more readable, more reliable. We talked about how to understand and leverage the truthy falsy nature of JavaScript and how important that is. We talked about variable prefixes, const, let, and var. We talked about style guides. Juan mentioned one called Idiomatic. There's a few of them out there. And then in addition to that, also tooling, things like Prettier, ESLint, and becoming familiar with how they work, how the rules work, and how you might be able to adjust the rules to fit your team's specific needs. And don't get caught up in like spaces versus tabs, like Juan said. Just pick one and be consistent. And that's really important. Did I miss any there, Juan?
I think so. Yeah. Unit testing, right? Pick a framework, always write unit tests, or pick a library, use unit tests, cleaner code. Also learn a bit about functional programming, because you're going to avoid side effects. You're going to write pure functions. We talk about pure functions. You're going to be careful with mutable data, right? And there's other things that go to functional programming. Maybe we can talk about it at some point. And module loaders, module bundlers, and and that will help you to become a good software engineer in 2020 and level up to land your first engineering job or to become the best engineer on your team. So yeah, awesome. That's it for today. So thank you so much for joining us in this episode of Dev Bootcamp Live. This is Juan Lizarazo.
And this is Jared Potter.
Thank you so much. I will see you next week.
See ya.